Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now, a few weeks ago I published this video that went over the solar photographs that I took whilst I was in Antarctica. I went over the setup process, the hurdles that I had to overcome, I showed a time-lapse of the photos that I took, and I showed a comparison of those photos versus photos that were taken from other locations on Earth around the same time to show that there was a clear change in the orientation of the sunspots at different latitudes. However, after I published that video, I was reading through some of the comments and I realized a few things. One, the time-lapse that I showed didn't actually include all of the photos that I took of the sun in Antarctica. Two, my recollection of the events in relation to when the photos were taken wasn't completely accurate. I'll blame the lack of sleep on that one. Three, people had actually sent me even more sunspot photos than I'd realized. I'll thank the spam filter for hiding those on me. So this is going to be sort of a correction / extension to that previous video. Firstly, with regards to the missing photos in the time-lapse. As I explained in the previous video, the EQ mount alignment wasn't perfectly accurate. The mount elevation was fractionally off, so the camera was actually circling on a slightly different inclination than what the sun was. Had I just left it alone completely for 24 hours, the sun would have drifted up out of the top of the shot, then it later would have drifted back down into the shot before carrying on right the way through out of the bottom of the frame, and then later drifted back up into frame and repeat. So that meant I actually had to keep going out to the camera fairly regularly and correcting the vertical aim of the camera in order to keep the sun visible in the frame. The problem that this later caused me, though, is if I just put all of the photos straight into a time-lapse, the sun would have been bouncing up and down on the screen like a game of Pong. So, whilst we were all at the airport heading home, MC Toon actually put together a little program that could automatically align the photos so that the sun was always in the center. It then cropped out all of the excess black void around the frame, and it overlaid the time and date information from the camera's EXIF data. And as I mentioned in the previous video, the camera was set to about 10 minutes behind GMT. So all of the timestamps here are basically GMT minus 10 minutes. However, Toon didn't actually give me the program, so I didn't render the time-lapse straight onto my computer. He had it on his computer, so I just copied all of the image files off of the memory card onto an external hard drive, and then I gave him the drive that he attached to his computer to make the time-lapse, and then gave it back to me. Then I explained in the video how I'd spent some time aligning the mount to make sure that it was tracking fairly accurately before I'd begun the 1-minute intervalometer shooting on the camera, and that prior to that, I'd just been taking odd test shots here and there. Now, I just presumed from memory that the first photos of the sun were taken during this alignment phase. Now, these were recorded on the camera at just after 7:30 p.m. And then the final image of the time-lapse was taken at 9:15 p.m. the following day, so just short of 26 hours between the first and last shots. However, once I published the video, there were several people commenting asking why the time-lapse only ran from midnight to 9 p.m. for a total of 21 hours, which confused me. So I went back and I checked the original photos more closely, and that's where I realized a few errors on my part. The first 3 photos of the sun on the memory card were taken at 1936, 1937, and 1939. But then the next photo in the sequence was shot at 23:55, more than 3 hours later. And I definitely didn't spend 3 hours trying to set up the EQ mount. Then it dawned on me that those were all GMT time, and we were 3 hours behind GMT. So the local time that I took those first 3 photos was around 4:30 in the afternoon, and then a jump to almost 9 p.m. When I then looked back through the video footage that I'd shot, I realized my mistake. When we first arrived at Union Glacier, they gave us a tour around the camp and explained all of the facilities, which then finished in the dining tent where they'd put some food out for us. But after that, we had a few hours waiting around the camp before we could go up to halfway point. Because whilst we'd made it to the main camp, all of our luggage was still being offloaded from the plane, along with supplies for the site. And the trucks that drag the trailers of luggage from the runway to the camp were slow. According to staff, it takes them about an hour to drive between the camp and the runway. Then, the staff had to unload all of that stuff and then ferry everyone's bags to their respective tents and then allow us some time to unpack and organise everything to work out what we were taking with us to halfway point and what we were leaving behind in the tent, before then loading all of our stuff onto the Tucker and driving us up to halfway point. So we actually had a good hour or more between us finishing eating our meals and the luggage arriving at our tents, where we were basically just left to chill out. So I'd video called home, I took a photo to post on YouTube, we all took a group photo that I'm calling Nipples on Ice. Toon broke out his frisbee, but then I found a video that I'd shot where I was documenting myself setting up the solar camera on the tripod to take some shots of the sun at the main camp. So these must be the first 3 photos on the memory card, whilst we were at the main Union Glacier camp. Then, fast forward a few hours and we get the photos from around midnight GMT, which were once we'd got up to halfway point and I was setting up the tracker. These were where the sporadic test shots were done. I took one at 23:55, then 23:56, then 2 shots at 15 and 16 minutes past midnight where I think I must have just caught the shutter button and missed the sun entirely, then one at 17 minutes past, a jump then to 39 minutes past, and then 44 minutes past, and from there on is when the regular 1-minute shots start. So that half an hour window was actually where I was fine-tuning the alignment and waiting until I had the tracking pretty good before I set the camera shooting regularly. So then my next confusion was that, well, the first photos at halfway point were shot just before 9 PM local time, but the last shots of the time-lapse were recorded at just after 6 PM. This is where I realised about the missing photos. The original file of the last shot in the time-lapse is file named DSC09999. And on Sony cameras that I use, once you reach the file number 9999, it reverts back to 0001, but it starts it in a new folder on the memory card as a protection, because if the first folder already has a photo 0001, then the camera would overwrite it. So when I'd sent the photos to Toon, I just copied the first folder from the memory card and forgot about the second. When I checked the second folder on the memory card, sure enough, there were another 225 photos on there. Now, I remember whilst I was live streaming, I went to check the camera and immediately realised it was no longer pointing at the sun.
Let him. I can't. Oh. I can't see.
Never mind.
Never mind. Why?
So, I think the tracker battery might have died, but thankfully I think we pretty much hit 24 hours.
Yeah, you hit 24.
And when I checked the time-lapse back afterwards, I noticed that the mount had begun turning in the other direction. Incidentally, this is actually a safety feature which was mentioned in the user manual. It's done to avoid the cables from wrapping around the mount. But what I noticed with these extra photos is that the sun drops almost completely out of frame up to photo 00133, which was taken at 8:30 PM local time. Then the sun recenters before drifting back down the frame again, and then in the final few photos, it tracks very quickly left across the frame, with the last glimpse of it being seen in photo 00193 that was taken just before 9:30 PM local time. This sudden left shift must have been caused where the mount reversed direction. But it confused me because I didn't recall the sun almost dropping out of frame earlier on and then me recentering it. So I went back through Will's 360 real-time video, and I noticed that after our last break away from the main camp for dinner, when we got back, myself and Will went over to check the cameras, and we realized immediately the sun was almost out of shot.
Oh no, we lost it. It's at the very bottom. Yeah, you want to fix it right away?
So I recentered the camera, and then I started to get prepared for my upcoming live stream. So here, in fact, is the complete time-lapse. The shots at halfway point show the sun visible for almost 24.5 hours across a total of 1,410 photos. Add to that the 3 shots that I took previously at the main camp, and that is some 28 hours between the first and last solar photos that I took in Antarctica. Then finally, along with discovering that I had more photos of the sunspots from Antarctica, I also realised that I had more photos of the sunspots from elsewhere around the world too, because some were hiding in my spam folder. I did receive a lot more photos than I've shown in these videos, however, some were taken on different days, by which point the sunspots had changed, and some shots the sunspots just weren't clearly visible for an actual comparison. But there were a few more usable ones from the northern hemisphere, which continue to show the same pattern as previous, with the triangle of sunspots being on the right-hand side pointing up. And whilst I had one photo from the southern hemisphere during the time that I was in Antarctica that I showed in the last video, which was taken in Tasmania, and I must apologise because a few people pointed out Tasmania is not south of Australia like I said, it's the southern part of Australia. Well, I actually found that a guy named Steve in Western Australia had sent me through videos of the sun, taken on both the 15th and the 16th. I also found I'd received another photo from the southern hemisphere that was taken in Buenos Aires, Argentina, but it was taken on the 17th of December, by which point I'd stopped taking solar photographs, and by that time new sunspots had formed. Although you can sort of see the same general triangle pattern along the bottom, but there's now new sunspots there as well, confusing things. However, I did coincidentally have somebody else send me a few solar shots that they took on the 17th of December from New Mexico. And again, we see comparing those two up, there's a different orientation to the sunspots. And I even received a cracking video that was taken from somebody by the name of Mega Saturn. They not only took photos of the sun from here in the UK while I was in Antarctica, but they also took a video as well. And you can see the sun in relation to the surroundings of their environment and that it is fairly low in the sky. Then they place a solar filter over the camera and zoom in so that you can see the sunspots. Then they zoom back out and remove the filter. And again, the sunspots are pretty much a 180-degree rotation compared to what I saw. And I'm sure there's probably people questioning if my photos are real. I mean, Flatsoid tried claiming that the time-lapse must be manipulated because Toon's program had centered and cropped all of the images. Some time to put together a little program script for me that automatically centered and cropped all of the photos.
Centered and cropped all the photos. Can they change the angular size?
Yep, they can.
Yep.
No doubt.
So they edited it then?
Yeah, even before they got back.
I think he's getting confused between cropping and resizing. Resizing would be actually changing the size of the sun in the photos. Cropping is just getting rid of parts of the photos. But all the original RAW files I put online with a link in the description so that everyone can go and check it for themselves. But just in case people might be questioning it, I actually took this photo with my phone of the back of my camera during the time-lapse shooting. I'd seen some sunspot photos that you guys had emailed over to me, and so I went to look on my camera how much the orientation was varying. Answer, by quite a lot. But the camera was still following the sun, so I couldn't exactly just take the camera off and take it inside to show people, so I decided to take a photo on my phone. Now, whilst I could easily view the photos by eye through the viewfinder, getting a photo using my phone of the inside of the viewfinder is very difficult. But then there was so much light reflecting back up at the rear screen, I couldn't get a straight photo of that either. So I had Jonathan come out with a blanket to cover me and the camera whilst I got a photo of the back screen. Now, this was taken December 15th at 1937 on my phone's time, which I think should still be down as GMT, which would then put it at about 4:30 in the afternoon local time. At that point, there was 1,348 photos taken. I still have that memory card in that camera, and you can see it carried on shooting way beyond that to over 1,600 photos. But the photos captured on the camera have the sunspot in a different orientation to the ones seen in the video from the Northern Hemisphere. So it's not like I've somehow rotated all of the raw files 180 degrees. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned that I'd put all of the time-lapse photos into a Google Drive folder for everyone to access. Now, when I realized that I'd missed some of the photos off the memory card, I put the first group of them straight onto the Google Drive, up to where the sun first almost drifts out of frame. I've now added the second group of photos after I'd recentered it and the mount started reversing direction, but I just wanted to hold off putting them online until this video was done and ready to go so that everyone can now have some context as to why the sun nearly drifted out of frame twice. And as one last bonus, I've had this very pleasant individual spamming my videos a lot recently, and he's actually brought up the topic of sun size at sunrise, claiming that the sun size changes at sunrise and sunset, and that proves the sun is local, and that apparently I'm a liar. Well, funnily enough, in the last video that I did, I showed a comparison of photos that I took of the sun with the exact same camera setup and settings, taken in Antarctica, Chile versus the UK, and showing that the sun remains the same size from all three locations despite them being thousands of miles apart, but apparently he wants to see sunset. Well, funnily enough, one of the mornings that we were in Punta Arenas, I got up early and went out to capture the sunrise. I shot the whole thing on my Insta360. I also had my A7 IV set up to shoot a wide view time lapse, and then I also had the A7 III with the 500mm lens and the K&F Concept solar filter that I would all be using in Antarctica to get a close-up view of the sunrise. Now, this particular view is cropped in, but if I bring up the original photo and I compare it to one of the originals that I took in Antarctica, oh dear Damascus Steel, it seems you were wrong. A local sun would get wider as it got closer, but the sun actually stays the same width, so bang goes that idea. And I think that is going to conclude this updates and corrections. As of filming, I haven't seen any flat earthers yet actually explain how the observations from my previous video work, i.e. the sunspot orientations as well as the sun appearing the same size in Antarctica, Chile and the UK. And I imagine the inclusion of even more photos now, including photos that I took at the main camp, probably isn't going to make that any easier. And so that's going to conclude this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.